Scripture this week comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly, the wind stopped and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." At one point, advice columnist Ann Landers claimed to receive something like 10,000 letters a month. And when people asked her what the most common theme to these 10,000 letters were, she said, "It seems that most people are afraid of something. They're afraid of losing their health or losing their job. They're afraid that something bad will happen to their family. They're afraid that they'll upset their neighbors or a friend, or committing even a social faux pas." Ours is a world of fearful people. I haven't worked long as the spiritual director at Samaritan Counseling, but I can tell you that in the very limited interactions that I have had, almost every single person who comes in is afraid. They're afraid that spiritually they're not going to do it right or get it right. They're afraid of not choosing the right denomination or believing the right thing or the right way or not doing the right things, or even afraid of not making the right choices in their lives. People are afraid. There's a great story about Tommy Lasorda. It was from a time when one of his teams was not playing very well. They'd been in a slump for some time and things were getting worse. The team had great athletes, but they were a group of good ball players, but they just weren't getting the job done. In one of the team's meetings, he was talking about how lousy the team had been fielding. And he asked him this question. He said, "Let's pretend it's the bottom of the ninth and we're about to get a run. We're ahead by only one run. There are 2 outs and the bases are loaded. The other team is up to bat and there's a good hitter coming up to the plate. Now, what are you thinking? Tell me, what's going through your mind?" he said. No one spoke up for a little while, until one brave player said, "Coach, I'll tell you what we're thinking. We're thinking, I sure hope he doesn't hit it to me." And Lasorda's face lit up and he said, "That's it. That's our problem. When the game is on the line, I want ball players out there thinking, 'Come on, give me a chance. I hope he hits this one to me.'" Do you suppose that maybe that's what God is trying to get us to think? Hoping that we'll be the people of faith who say, "Come on, give me a chance at this." I've never counted it, but I've heard from reliable sources that it says 365 times in our Bible some sort of "do not fear, do not be afraid, be not afraid." Maybe the people who lived during biblical times were super fearful people. Or maybe God just knew that it's a natural human tendency for people to kind of worry and be afraid. Our pastor Jinx is taking 3 well-deserved weeks off to refresh and refuel and renewal. And I'm kind of holding down the fort and preaching a sermon series that we call Pinterest Fails and Life Hacks. Pinterest fails are those funny little stories or pictures that we see where we see an original picture of something on Pinterest that's really cool, a really cool idea, and then someone tries it and it's a less than stellar attempt to pull it off. For example, there are these pictures. A happy kiss and a not so happy kiss. A happy Christmas card, joy for the season, and a not so happy joy. Life hacks are those tips and tricks that people share to help one another, to make something a little easier. And last week we talked about Pinterest fails and as being nothing more than an attempt at learning something. Oftentimes it's funny and entertaining, but it's not bad. It's just that we're less than masterful at most things, so it's to be expected. We're not professionals or masters. We're accomplished at very few things, and so it stands to reason that we would be less than accomplished at most things. And the life hack we discussed last week was truth. Not so much about how honorable it is to be truthful at all times, but more like being truthful with ourselves rather than deceiving ourselves, being bold enough to admit who we are, admit where we are less than accomplished, so that we have a better place from which to work, so that we have a better chance at becoming who God calls us to be. So that we can be more accomplished at who God calls us to be, because we're starting from a place of truth, who we really are. Well, this week, as you've probably already figured it out, we're talking about fear, the emotion that most of the time is irrational and paralyzing. Fear keeps us from even trying a Pinterest project in the first place. My daughter Lonnie is working on her master's degree in social work and was working on a final earlier this past week. And some of her research brought her to a podcast given by Brené Brown, a social worker, an author, a speaker who's pretty popular even in the world of religion. It just so happened that Brené Brown touched on what I was working on for this sermon. She suggested that fear stems from us avoiding vulnerability. We're afraid to be seen. We're afraid to be really and truly seen. We feel like we aren't worthy, and so we tend to hide rather than try. She said the antidote to that is courage. From the word cur, the Latin word meaning heart. So originally, courage meant to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. That's courage. Today's Pinterest fail is fear, but today's life hack is courage. The courage to be imperfect, the courage to risk being compassionate, to be kind to ourselves and to others. The courage to risk authenticity. Let go of who you think that you have to be and just be who you are. The courage to let go of fear, to embrace the truth, to embrace vulnerability, to risk making mistakes and getting it wrong, so that we learn and are more accomplished and do better. Brené Brown says we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And I say, this is something we have to practice. This lamb cake that we keep showing in every sermon, this lamb cake is having courage. And it rarely looks like this. More often, it looks like this. But the cake is us at least trying. I'm risking vulnerability and comfort, and I'm learning the life hack, which will help me be more fearless the next time. In today's scripture, the disciples are in the boat with Jesus when the storm comes up. And the disciples are freaking out and whining, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" And as you recall, Jesus wakes up and commands the disciples, commands the things the disciples are afraid of by saying, "Silence, be still." And suddenly there's this great calm. There was peace. The thing that the disciples were afraid of is suddenly nothing to be afraid of. And then Jesus asks them, "Why are you afraid?" I'm the one sitting here sharing this message with you. That doesn't mean that I'm the one who's masterful at our Pinterest effort. All it means is that I'm aware of what I need to do. And sometimes my lamb cake looks better than it does at other times. For example, you're all aware that our Jasper, our new baby, is a foster child. And I always said years ago that I could never have a foster child, that would just break my heart. Then I learned from people who had foster children a different way of thinking about it. Foster children need us so much. They need us so much more than I need to be comfortable, and then I need to not take the risk. So now we find ourselves in this exact situation that many years ago I said I would avoid in order just to protect my heart. My family's opened our home, and more significantly, we've opened our hearts to this little man. We've made ourselves vulnerable because should the time come that he goes someplace besides our home, a very big chunk of our heart will break. And I often find myself worrying about that. I worry that he'll face challenges when he's not with us and that there's nothing I can do to help fix those things. I worry that he won't know how much we love him. And I worry about all the potentially bad things that can happen to him. I regularly find myself crying out, "Teacher, don't you care that I'm drowning over here?" And in those moments, Jesus calms the storm in me. Jesus calms the wind and waves that are going on inside of me by saying, "Peace, be still." Haven't I already taken care of him? Wasn't I taking care of him when I put him in your home? And don't you trust that I love him even more than you do? And I'm better able to take care of him than you are. Friends, we're not perfect. But the good news is we were never intended to be. We were intended to be fully and wholly and wonderfully and fearlessly, or at least attempting to be fearlessly, exactly who God created us to be. And that means that sometimes we're wide-eyed and windswept and soaking wet and white-knuckled, holding on the passenger's boat that God put us on. Being in scary, uncomfortable, vulnerable situations. Because those are the only places that we can practice not being afraid and trusting God.